Welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore, everybody. It is a real treat to have Andrew Gross here on the actual publication date. His, what I'm going to call a career changer of a novel here. This is a really wonderful novel for one man. A lot to talk about, so please give Andrew a nice warm welcome. Yeah, and the Rook has a critical significance to the book. Everybody purchases a copy of the one man gets one of these guys. I'll make sure you all get one.
You have to buy the other 30, 16, 34, how many? 16 and 30, right? 33 pieces.
Okay.
I don't need this.
Do you need it? Well, it's for the live stream. We're doing this online.
So, anyway. Hello? Is that on?
Yeah, we're gonna,
I think it's on.
Okay. We're going to begin with this novel. Has anybody read it yet? Anybody read it? All right. Awesome. Okay. Really fantastic book. Well researched. Obviously a very personal book for you.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what led you to write it? Was this something that you had in the back of your mind for a long time?
What I had in the back of my mind was writing something different than some of the books that I had been writing. I think in terms of how this book came about, there's the how and then there's the why. And maybe just for a minute or two talk about the why. You know, I wrote, and anyone who's heard me, read my books or heard me before, I write suburban thrillers. And basically have everyday heroes, guys, gals, moms, dads, yoga moms, hedge fund managers who, you know, maybe through some misstep or through fate, take a step into the wrong hotel room or whatever might happen that suddenly turns their life from a trajectory this way to this way. And generally involves the kids, and then you have to extricate them. And I wrote 9 of them. And at some point I just felt really constrained, not only by the niche that my publisher was insisting that I be in, but maybe even that my readers expected as well. I wanted to write different kind of books. I would say, you know, books with bigger bones and broader themes to them, because they were the kind of books that I like to read, and they were the kind of books that I grew up with. And I always liked books that would transport you to a different place and time, you know. And so, you know, and always, you know, had that sort of historical what if it just hadn't worked out the way that real life did work out, where would we be? So I wanted to do that, and coincidentally, I guess, my contract, long-term contract, came to an end, and with that were some of those expectations, and so I had an idea hit me. You said it was personal, and some of the stories built around family history. My father-in-law came to this country when he was 18, and he was right before the war, 6 months before the war. He came as an exchange student. And of course, 6 months after that, Poland was invaded. He never learned the fates that befell any of his family, and he was the only person in his family to survive. So I've known him 30 some odd years, and he always carried this sort of veil of unhappiness with him, even when he was smiling, even, you know, he was successful, but even despite his successes, there was always something you could read into his heart that he was never, you know, at peace with. And he wouldn't tell anyone what it was. As a matter of fact, like a lot of survivors, he never talked not only about the war, but he never talked about his family. My wife, until recently, didn't even know who her grandparents were. He just completely blacked out that whole part of his life. In 1941, when America got in the war, he enlisted, and because of his facility with languages, was put into the OSS. So he did something in there, and he never talked about that aspect of his life either. So we had all of this, we had these holes to fill, And I looked at him and I said, I want to write his story. I want to see what's behind this, grief or guilt that he's carrying forward. And so what happens after is my version of his story.
Right. Well, what's so amazing, as we all know about that generation in particular, it's just, you don't have to look very far, and it's just packed with, these stories of ordinary people put into extraordinary circumstances and either rising to the occasion, and these acts of quiet heroism. And there's a lot of that in this book, several of the different characters. It's kind of an entry point into the book. The opening sequence, there's a man, I believe he's 96 years old, who's just like the person you've described, who has held on to this story, and finally starts to talk. And can you kind of give us an entryway into the book through there?
Well, he's in an old age home. He is 96. His wife has died. His daughter comes to visit him, and there's a little bit of banter between them. But in cleaning out the house after his wife dies, she comes upon some things that she can't explain. One of them is a rook with a tag on it. One of them is a photograph of an attractive woman in a boat with sort of a nautical hat, like a floppy white hat turned up, and then the other is a Distinguished Service Cross medal, and a picture of him receiving it with a woman that they don't fully know, and so she puts these things in front of him, and you can see that for the first time in 40 years, he's actually seen these things, and they become the lens that he brings back the things of his past. And she convinces him to finally talk to her about his life and how he got these things. She says, "You were a hero." He said, "No, I wasn't a hero. You don't understand." And she goes, "Well, then just tell me, Pop. Tell me at last." And he finally gives it over. And the postscripts or the prologue ends with him saying, "It's not about this woman. It's not about either of these women. It starts, if you really want to know, it's about two men who were running for their lives. And those two men are the only two people who successfully escaped from Auschwitz, who took with them documentation of the kind of atrocities that were going on there, managed to escape, ended up being picked up by the partisans, and within weeks, their chronicles, their stories, were on the desk of Roosevelt and his war cabinet. And that's sort of how this book begins.
Right. And also at the heart of the book is science, really. The race to get this technology that would finally end the war. And in your book, there's a scientist who finds himself in Auschwitz, and we can't give too much away. But I mean, the basic, who's the one man,
Yeah, I think we can do that.
Basic setup.
Well, here, the novel is about an escaped Polish Jew who's convinced to go back to where his parents were murdered, to smuggle out the one man that the Allies believe can win them the war. And that man is an atomic scientist, and the place where he ends up is Auschwitz. So he has 72 hours, basically, to be dropped in there, find his way into Auschwitz, locate someone, and then smuggle him out. And I think it's all pretty thought out. It doesn't quite sound as ludicrous, or it isn't quite as ludicrous as it might sound, although it is a suicide mission. And he knows that going in, and he's doing it for certain reasons of his own heritage, for his own faith and his own family, to honor his family who he left behind, basically. Because, so that's the hero of the book, whose name is Nathan, and the one man is a physicist named Mendel, who, I don't want to give too much away, but I don't think this is killing it, I won't even say, but is an expert in one particular form of science that the Allies feel they need to get the bomb before the Germans. And the book begins with a postscript from Oppenheimer, and it basically says that unless we get cracking, it's not exactly how he said it, the Germans are going to beat us to the bomb. And so there was that sort of hysteria that was in all the war cabinets at that time, that they didn't know what Germany had, but they thought they had a lot, and they were struggling with a lot of the science, and so they had to find this one guy.
Right, and then, you know, you do a remarkable job of kind of writing about life, the realities of life in Auschwitz, you know, and just how desperate the situation was, obviously. The scientist, the old man, you know, he takes under his wing this very gifted young boy who's a chess master in the camps, and starts to sort of make him learn some of the mystic arts of his trade.
You know, Patrick, I'm someone who muddled his way through 8th grade earth science, so believe me, when I started delving into atomic physics, it was pretty daunting to me. But you read it. I think I give a lot of it back, or I give as much as you need to know. It's not, you know, you're not going to go out there and suddenly work for NASA, if NASA still exists. I don't know.
It's funny, my wife has a degree in physics.
Oh, does she?
She teaches science, and she was
Did you run this by?
Yeah, she's like, wow, this guy's done his homework.
Wow.
Yeah, it's also about the research.
But even better, well, the great seminal work, which I would actually say, I would recommend people read, because I thought it was one of the most brilliant books I've ever read, was The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes.
It's a great book.
It's a great book. It's just the history of the science, not just it's not you know, over anybody's head, but just the history of atomic thought starting, you know, in the 20s and going on was really fascinating. But basically, one of the things I learned from my days with Patterson is be careful how you give information, because you just don't want to put people to sleep. And, you know, you need to dole out as much as you need to know to make this credible. And I thought it was really important that everyone know and understand what this guy knew, why someone was risking their life. If all it is just a term like gaseous diffusion, it doesn't mean anything to anyone. So there's a lot that's given to you, but it's all done in the form of dialogue between this gifted, brash young student who thinks he knows everything in the world, who becomes a student, and the professor, so to speak, the scientist, who begins to, I don't think it's giving too much away, begins to feel that he may not make it out, and yet he has information he wants to get out. And when he comes across this boy, and the boy passes these tests, I think, in an amazing way. I mean, he's just, you know, it was fun to write about him, because, you know, he's the kind of person who can say that, you know, 57 years ago you were born on a, you know, Grant, you were born on a Tuesday. What's your birthday? And he'll just give it like that. And actually, I had to research how people do that, because I just didn't want to say it. I wanted to back it up. So there is some. I don't know if anyone read I, Pilgrim. Did anyone read that book? It's a really good thriller. But there was a lot of information given in that book, and I really admired the way that it was done, because it was just made interesting, you know, and you were given information at the same time. At least in my case, there's this back and forth between these two characters that makes it palatable.
Yeah, it's tempered by the kid who's saying, "Oh man, this is boring. Why do I have to learn this crap? Blah blah blah." You know, and that's basically the reader.
Yeah,
the reader.
that's the reader.
Yeah, so it really kind of gives it to you in digestible chunks. You know, it's funny. We're talking in the back just about, you know, how extraordinary this time period was in so many different ways. And you got all these great minds kind of escaping and ending up in Los Alamos, you know, in the middle of the desert, Fermi and Bohr and all these wonderful scientists. Was it kind of, did you go down the rabbit hole kind of researching this kind of thing?
Well, I don't want to overstate it on the science. You know, I had to do a little chess research too, because chess has a leitmotif in it also. You know, when you write thrillers that take place in Greenwich, Connecticut, that might have something to do with someone mismanaging money, you can screw around a bit with fact and the truth, you know, and you can always sort of wing it, and you can hide behind the curtain of fiction. When you're a Jew writing about the Holocaust, you're holding the Holy Grail, and you don't screw around with that. And I knew it going in. I also knew that my agent did his thesis in Holocaust literature at Yale, and he wasn't going to tolerate. He set me a very high bar, incredibly high. He made me basically go back and find precedents for every aspect of the book, because he said, you can't fictionalize the Holocaust for purposes of entertainment. So everything you put in here has to build on some element of truth. And literally wasn't going to represent the book, and we're buddies, and at least he said he wasn't, until I went back and just found that, yes, someone actually had snuck into Auschwitz and out, you know, all of these aspects. And so anyway, there was a lot of work, a lot of research in it. But one of the things I want to say, you know, I was against even using the word Auschwitz. I don't think you'll find it in marketing, because I thought that would potentially turn more people off than it would bring in. And I mean, a lot of people, and I think especially Jewish people, we just feel like, I've read this, I've seen it, I've seen the movies, I've been to the museums, I've read the books, and I don't really need to read something that will be dark and focused on atrocity. This is sort of an uplifting book, even though it's sad at the end. I think it's a book about the human spirit and survival and goodness winning out. So to me, I wanted it to be about heroism. So that was sort of the balance that I, you know, treaded, bless you, all the way through. The book was, you had to make it graphic enough to know the dangers that Nathan was dealing with, to make it that any moment he could die. But at the same time, I didn't really want it to be about cruelty and perversion and twistedness or anything like that. So,
well, it's all there, you know, and in the deep, there's some really telling little details that give you a sense of what life was like there. And one of the ones that occurs to me is our young man has the task of cleaning out all the latrines, as it were, which are the slot buckets, right? And his task, and you talk about how, you know, the Germans like to have fun with these guys, and you kind of nudge them, kick them. And of course, if they tipped the bucket just a little bit, you got a little bit of the, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I thought that was legitimate, because you were dealing with the fear that he may not survive the next 15 minutes, and you know, here's a guy that's on this heroic mission, and he's literally dealing in the latrines and carrying this, and so there was a chance to sort of show brutality there. I actually have an anecdote. There is a scene in there. You know, these are small things in the book, so you're not giving too much. There's a scene in there where one of the prisoners has a gun put to the back of his head, and the sergeant major is about to shoot him, and he shoots him, and the gun misfires. And he goes like, fuck. He takes another gun, and he shoots him. It takes the same, shoots him again, the gun misfires. Shoots him a third time, pulls the trigger, and the gun doesn't. And so at some point, he gets distracted, you know, and the guy scurries away, you know. And about a couple of months, maybe it's now 5 or 6 months ago, my wife and I were in Florida, and we were watching Schindler's List. You know, we actually didn't intend to, but it came on, and I said, in light of this, how can we not see this again? You know? So, and by the way, I thought it was a better movie. I think it must have been the 3rd or 4th time I've seen it, but it was certainly the first time since I took this project on. And somewhere in the movie, this happens. You know, click, click, click. And I'm like going, no! You know, I'm pointing at the screen. I said, did I just steal a scene from like the most well-watched movie in history, you know, from Spielberg, you know? I said, that's not how I got this. I got this story from a man named Morris Pilberg, who was my daughter's boyfriend's, at the time, grandfather, and he told me this story. He gave it to me. It was in his Shoah testimony, which is, you know, the people who survived the Holocaust gave their stories, and they're all part of the show a project which records all these first-hand stories. And then I realized, you know what? Spielberg took and admitted to taking his stories from people's Shoah testimony. Maybe we both took it from the same person, which is what I think happened, you know, exactly. We both, yeah.
Well, getting back to the heroism that you see all throughout this book, you see these people that, you know, that they rise above themselves, if you want to say that. There's a little bit in the book, for me anyway. I don't want to impose my own interpretation of your book, but I thought that was kind of the key right there.
Wait a minute.
Yeah. That bit that Strauss reads.
Ah, yes, yeah. Well, it's part of the reason why someone might go to save one man on a mission that he knows he may not survive, and it's taken from the Mishnah, from the Mishnah Sanhedrin, which is sort of a collection of Jewish laws that's built off the Torah. And it reads, it was for this reason that man, it's actually about the story of Adam. It was for this reason that man was first created as one person, to teach you that anyone who destroys a life is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world, and any who saves a life is as if he has saved an entire world. And that's what he says to his commanding officer as to why he's doing this, which is motive for going back.
Now, with respect to the OSS and the FDR and how much knowledge they actually had about the atrocities and what was going on at that time, can you kind of speak about that a little bit and how this was sort of brought into the world's consciousness?
Well, these two escapees were, you know, up until that point, there was strong suspicion. I mean, towns were disappearing, and no one ever heard from them again. And there was an enormous amount of stuff that was coming back through the Orthodox Jewish community to the rabbis in America that people were being taken to camps, but no one knew what was going on inside them. And early on, there wasn't the mass liquidation that it evolved into, but it was obviously still brutal. And you know, cities, ghettos were being cleaned out, and so there was an element of doubt by which I think the Roosevelt administration was operating under, that they could hide behind. The State Department was also totally WASP and totally anti-Semitic at that point. Anyone who's read In the Garden of the Beasts by Larson, that comes across, you know, a lot more convincingly than I wrote, you know. But there were a lot of reasons why Roosevelt, whose administration had more Jews in it than any president in history, still balked at doing anything. It was actually the fighting between the isolationist Republicans and the Democrats behind Roosevelt, who did want to engage, was as bitter and divisive as the fighting is now between, like, the Tea Party and the Democrats. You know, it was really a rough time, and Roosevelt was facing re-elections, and there was also, we were also at the end of the Great Depression, and you know, nobody wanted to let immigrants into this country then, just as some people aren't so keen on it now. You know, it's actually very reminiscent of the times, and it was extremely vitriolic. But, you know, there was a Jewish ship. Now, I don't know why it's escaping me, the name of it. It's well known. A ship full of Jews that went around originally to Havana. They wouldn't let them unload there. They came here. They were not permitted to let them off here. It was like 350 of them, and most of them ended up perishing. Then they were sent back to Europe. You know, so you couldn't really bring anyone in. So it was in this environment that this stuff comes forward. And then the question is, in these war council meetings, there's two of them in the book, what do you do about it, you know? And there are people, Blumenthal was the Secretary of the Treasury, is we have to do something. At the very least, we have to bomb the tracks leading into it so that they can't bring people in. And Roosevelt just felt that we have an invasion coming up, we're not going to divert aircraft, you know. As it was said, the best thing is to win the war as fast as possible, and then we'll save these people. So it was really, you know, it's hard to really think what it was like then, because certainly FDR, is always perceived. I mean, he certainly was a person that was as humanistic as there was in the presidency, you know. But you know, there's a lot of sides of the Jews that never really were very happy with Roosevelt. So.
Right. Again, I don't want to spoil things, but there's so much cool stuff to talk about with this book. I can't help myself. Our young chess prodigy, he strikes up a kind of a singular friendship with the wife
Right.
of Commandant, I wrote down the name, Ackerman. And she's another one of these characters
It was surprising, I think.
who was very surprising.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Well, someone yesterday, I was at the book launch today, but I had an event at Barnes & Noble yesterday in New York, and one of the questions was, like, you know, well, I don't know if it was a question or a statement, that there are Germans in here that just don't, they don't act in a traditional way, you know, and well, some do, of course, because, you know, the guards were the guards, and the people who were doing bad stuff were doing it, and the people who were the commandants it was all about numbers, basically, you know, you didn't want to fall behind the plan. But there are a couple of surprising people in there, and there is sort of an Inspector Javert figure, I guess, who is the main adversary in here that has been disgraced in Portugal. He is a member of the Abwehr, the German intelligence group or force, and he wants to regain his stature, and he's been given this petty job, basically, of sniffing down escaped Jews outside of Warsaw, when he used to be on the track to sort of be, you know, the head of intelligence in Portugal. And Lisbon was a key place to be there, and he just wants to sort of, you know, prove himself and get back. So he is a little bit sort of like the guy who's chasing down Jean Valjean, I guess, in the sense that, you know, he's single-minded, and, you know, he sniffs out that there's a plot and is sure that someone's there. So you do have a cat and mouse. You do have a chase in here that's, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's also, you know, just the various different guards within the camp. You know, we learn, you know, how somebody like Leo or the professor kind of has to maneuver around the camp. You know, there are certain guards that, you know, are not beneath taking a little bribe here and there.
Yeah, there was a whole sense of commerce in these camps,
Yeah.
and it's something I learned in my own research. And you know, ultimately, when your number was up, but until your number was up, there was a way to live, not well, but there was a way to get stuff done. And I guess we certainly can't talk about it, but I think there were two surprises in the book, one that takes place in the camp and one near the end, that are really sort of those moments, I think, where it turns the book upside down. And I love those as a thriller writer. I mean, those are the kind of things you sort of pray you can get one in a book, where I sort of call them, when we teach, Grant and I both taught a course in July in New York, and I sort of call it, you know, a hinge, where literally the book just sort of reverses on its hinge, and then you have these aha moments where you go, that's what the book's about, you know. So I think there's a couple in here too. And
you mentioned a little bit about the partisans, you know, and they were very fascinating too. You know, they tremendous acts of heroism on their part. Was it fun to research some of that too?
Well, I don't know that I researched that aspect of it, you know, so much. You know, it's fun to. I like taking ordinary characters and having them sort of have. I mean, here's my thing. When you watch shows like Frasier, like comedies or something, it's never the lead people who are really the memorable characters. You know, you watch Seinfeld, you know. Jerry Seinfeld's a bore to me. He's a total bore, you know, and a neurotic bore at that, you know. But all the other characters are the characters. So to me, I love the idea of just taking incidental characters and making them really memorable in the short amount of time that you have to do that in a book. So you know, if I was ever going to get an Oscar, I want it for supporting actor. I don't want it for, you know, I love doing that in these books, and I think it's a rich book, you know. And both in terms of detail and which it has to be, because I think the detail of the book, it's so much more it's so much more atmosphere than I've ever put in a book before, and I think it's what gives this book its life, at least to me, is the amount of detail, but still reads pretty quick, right? I mean,
I asked Andrew in the back, I said, so did this experience, writing this book, did it sort of whet your appetite for more historical crime novels? I was pleased with his answer.
Well, my next one is already done. It's the benefit of having. This is a long-awaited moment for me. I turned this manuscript in almost a year and a half ago. I've been on pins and needles for a long time, as well as the fact that I've written another World War II book. So this better succeed, because I got another one coming down the road. But this one is actually about a British. It's just a little more like an Alistair MacLean novel. It's about a British Norwegian raid. Some of you may know what I'm talking about, but on the German heavy water facility in Vermork that really ended the Nazis' attempts to get an atom bomb. So it's a little like that. No Jews in this one, Norwegians and Brits, but it was such an act of courage and daring that I came across it in my research on this book, and I just say, God, I didn't know anything about this. This is such an amazing story. I mean, there's a one man there too. I can't call it that, but there's one man that literally took it upon himself to end the entire heavy water production that killed the bomb for Germany. And so it's such a great story that that's what's next. Already done.
Awesome. Before I open it up to questions, one final thing I wanted to ask you, which was about this generation. Why do you think it was that? And it's kind of heartbreaking to see the generation fading. Why do you think it was that World War II generation, it was so common for them to keep all this quiet, not to talk about it? Was it just wanted to get on and forget it all?
I don't think anyone really discovered post-traumatic stress syndrome then. It was before that was either a term or I think for whatever reason that generation seemed to internalize it and live with it more and not. I don't think they were brought up to externalize their feelings, and I'm just really speaking to people I know. I don't consider myself to be an expert on the subject, but in the generation now, or even from Vietnam on, we've been taught to talk about things, and the media and the public it gives you so much access and opportunity. But I don't think these people, what do? I mean, Tom Brokaw will tell you, they came back, they went to school, they got married, and they lived out their lives. And I'm sure all of these horrible things that they, were scars on their souls, but didn't come forth. In terms of my stepfather, in terms of my father-in-law, he just couldn't confront his. I'll tell you. This is worth saying. I wanted to really use this as a lens into why he had this burden of sadness, and so the book was my way of writing it. After he died in February actually, my wife was looking through his stuff in Florida, and she came across something remarkable, and it was a trove of letters, and the letters were written to him by his mother in the first 2 years that he was in this country, and he never shared it with anyone. And so our neighbor in New York is from Poland, and so we were having a memorial down in Florida, and we got them, I didn't do anything, my wife got them translated in 24 hours. There were about 10 or 12 letters, and we read them for our family during his memorial. And what it showed, most of the letters, they were all written by his mother, and his mom was a modern, funny, warm-hearted person, and it was the first glimpse anyone ever had in the family into their grandmother. And all she was writing in every letter is, Nathan, because his name was Nathan, why do you not write us back? Why haven't we heard from you? And I realized that what he probably carried with him was that they all died, and his letters were probably stopped by the censors. One of the letters, I should say, it starts out where it's just his old address, and then all of a sudden they're all stamped by swastikas. So there were censors reading what came out, and it would say Warsaw Deutschland on them, which just was interesting to me when they were in the ghetto. But obviously his letters never got back there. And so they died, and he probably thought they went to their graves thinking he didn't love them, or he never wrote them, or whatever. And to me, I think that was sort of part of, it's very compelling, it's very poignant what he probably carried with him. So.
Right, and that the whole notion of survivor's guilt is a very complicated feeling. Let's open it up to questions. I'm sure you have some. Anybody?
Yes.
Andrew, how do you go back, or do you go back to writing what you termed earlier as an easy novel?
That's a great question.
Well, if I do, you probably can tell this didn't sell so well. I'm hoping I don't have to be honest with you. It is going to be difficult, you know.
Must be more of a passion now.
Yeah, I'm going to try to. I'm treading water a little bit now because I want to see where, you know. Let's see what happens. But they don't have to. It probably won't be World War II novels. But even more than historicals, I want to write things that have much more atmospheric settings, where the settings are as much a part of the story as the plot itself. And I'm thinking of doing something, a thriller that's I'm going to base, if I do it, in the Hasidic community of New York, where I came across some pretty interesting scandal, and it just sort of occurs to me that I can, you know, I have an idea that's a little like. I'm blank. What was the movie with Harrison Ford where he goes back to the Quaker, to the Witness? I sort of have something in mind that might be a little like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in a different time, although it's really much better to write thrillers before cell phones and cameras, right? You know what you agree, right? Yeah, it's a lot easier when there isn't a camera in every lobby or a cell phone that keeps you in touch with everyone. So.
Any questions?
How long did it take you to write The One Man?
It didn't take me as long to write it as it did to plot it. Now, I outline heavily, and I sold an outline. I didn't sell the book, I sold an outline. If you read the outline, you would probably think you were reading a slightly abridged version of the book. It was really well thought out. There was maybe one or two things, actually one or two important things, that came to me along the way of writing it. But a lot of the scenes, I somehow think that the work you do up front in that process is the best work that I do in a book. And maybe not everybody works that way, but I constantly am reinforcing my own, you know, reason why I do it. And it's hard work to outline in advance because it's a little kind of like playing chess with yourself. And you have to stay 30, 40, 50 moves ahead of yourself. It's hard. But it's how I plot. It's my process. So you know, the whole thing probably took a year and a half, but I think it was probably almost split evenly between putting an outline together. And then that's what I sold. I've actually sold 2 books. My first book, The Blue Zone, was sold off an outline, which is pretty rare to get a 3-book deal on your first novel off an outline. Very rare. It may have never happened before, to be honest with you, in fiction. And then this book was sold off of it, and it wasn't the easiest book to sell. I have to be honest. I think a lot of people were, you know, if Andy sticks to his knitting, we'd love to have him here, but you know, I think some people didn't know if I had the chops to do this, and how it would turn out, and you know,
It's not exactly like summer feel good.
Right.
Well, I'm not sure I always did that, but you know, it was a little more familiar territory. So.
Somebody over here.
Here's the same question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
You're up.
I said I had the same question.
Same
Oh,
questions.
yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think when I think of the World War II era, I mean, I personally love that, and I think of Joseph Kanan and the First and Philip Kirk. They all dwell heavily in that. Did you ever, you know, being, you know, with your place as an author, did you ever talk to these guys or guys like them to?
I wrote Alan
share
first
ideas,
about the
or?
book, but he didn't return it.
Okay.
So, but I read first, you know, although I'm getting a little tired of it, I gotta be honest. I just think I know he comes here, doesn't he? So I don't want to say anything, but I mean, it's you know, but I've read most of his books, you know, and I've read Canaan, and I never know, I've met him actually, I never know is it Canaan or Canaan, I've been introduced to him and I forget the right, Canaan, it's it, the right pronunciation on him. And, you know, I grew up on books like, you know, The Key to Rebecca, or you know, Marathon Man, or The Boys from Brazil, or, you know, stories like that, which I don't know if anyone ever read a book, it wasn't based in the war, but it was about the Reich after, called The Wind Chill Factor. Did anyone ever read that? It was one of my favorite books. Thomas Gifford. He's a good writer, and I guess never quite had the home runs, but I always loved that book, The Wind Chill Factor.
Well, I have a question for you, which is, actually, this is the
So what did Lynn think of it after you wrote it? What did, because I know she does most of your editing and stuff. What did, I'm not sure, I'm sorry, she reads it for you. So what did she think of it?
Yeah, I think she'd be honored to hear you say that. What did she think of the book?
Yeah, what did
She thinks it's awesome. She
Well,
thinks it.
I know she goes through the whole process with you every time you write a book.
Yeah,
so,
it's drifting away, that process a little
Yeah.
bit.
So did she feel like she took the same journey with you, or a different
Yeah,
journey?
it was an important book because it was, you know, built off of her father's story. So it was certainly an important book for her, which in a way didn't allow her the objectivity into it that I sometimes like from her. My wife is a very literal reader, and the truth is, I think, do you read Grant stuff?
I do. He gives me certain passages to read.
But not, do you
Not
read the,
as he goes along.
You have those moments where you're just sure this doesn't make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I use my wife for. Almost exclusively what I use her for. What doesn't make sense? To have her remind me what in my life doesn't make sense. But she, you know, but she's good for me because she's very, very literal in how she reads, and of course all those moments that you think you're sort of prancing with the angels in your prose, and this is why they're paying you the big bucks, and you come down and you sort of throw something and go like, read that, you know, and you know she'll read it and she'll go like, this doesn't make any sense, you know, and I'll throw a few F words out and say, and I do, and go back upstairs, read it again, and go, it doesn't make much sense. So you know they're always good to have. In a broader way too, they're good to have for that reading. At least for me. There's a lot I do that doesn't make sense.
You know, this is being recorded.
It's out there.
Well, you know, it's funny in the back, you know, Drew said that his first published book was a, you know, James Patterson novel, and he said when your first published book goes to #1 in the New York Times bestseller list, that's not too bad.
You know,
That's a tough place to start, though. Where do you go from there?
Well, I'm going there. I've never been back. I once did a panel with, who was on it? Lee Child, Harlan Coben, Michael Connolly, what I was doing on it, I don't even know, and Joe Finder and I, and they were talking about how long it took to get them, you know, how, by the way, that whole trajectory doesn't exist anymore. You can't make it to the top in this sort of way anymore, the way that everybody did, you know, just sort of gaining enough critical mass after 10 books. It doesn't exist anymore. But that's how they all got there, until there was one breakout book, let's say, and I sort of went, my first 6 books went to #1, you know.
Now, what was, you know, writing those Patterson books, was that a good apprenticeship for you in a sense, in learning how to craft a thriller? Yeah,
I learned a lot. I mean, it was good, and it was an albatross as well. It's been an albatross because I'm always referred to as Patterson co-writer. It's hard to free yourself from that. You know, I came in. I mean, there's more good than bad, but my first printing was 144,000 copies, one gross. You know, my first book, The Blue Zone. I came in with all these #1s behind me. And you know what it's like to sort of be a co-writer, but I was early on there, and you know, had my name equal with him, so that it platformed me as someone who could have bestseller status right off the bat. I didn't go to A-ball and B-ball the way that everybody came up and apprenticed, you know.
So the pressure's on.
Well, it's not, that pressure's gone. I mean, that pressure was years ago. But now it's different because I know I've made a turn in my own career, and we'll see if it's a smart one or not. I'm hopeful it is.
Did your father-in-law get to read the book before it is completed?
That's a good question. When he was sort of he was in a bad state for a while. But my wife read him the prologue, and he actually took her hand and told her to stop. I don't think she got through the whole way, and said, "Liddy, there are some things I want to talk to you about," and shared some aspects of his upbringing a little bit. So it was nice that the book was sort of an agent for that thing. Yeah.
Successful.
Yeah. So whatever happens with the sales is sort of just the irrelevant and the icing on the cake.
Doesn't matter, you're Andrew Gross. That's right.
Now, how about the obvious film? Has this been optioned? I'm sure it has.
It hasn't. I mean, it's hard to believe. I'm represented by creative artists out in LA, and I've had enough books where they have been completely indifferent to what, from a movie point of view. Even though all of my novels sort of read like they should be movies,
Oh my
but
God, they should be.
but you know, when you look at what's made today, they're not all right in the strike zone. This book had total enthusiasm from the president all the way down, and they sent it out to 30 of the most recognizable names in Hollywood, and everybody's passed so far. I guess after Finding Nemo, you know, making a book with this kind of subject matter just isn't really on. I don't know. I actually think it was sold too high, and I think I'll get another bite at the apple. But I think it would have been more someone who would make it more of a personal endeavor than any of the big, you know, the J.J. Abrams and this. Spielberg's already done this, so he wasn't. But
Was this all pre-pub though?
yeah. Oh wait, it was all way pre-pub. It was literally in manuscript form.
Yep.
Yeah. So hopefully, I'd like to think I'll get another bite when the book comes out if it does well. So.
Anybody else have any thoughts?
Andy, what are you gonna do with Ty?
Ty, I think I left him off in a good place in the last book. He went home, and that was the last word. If I remember, that was the very last word of that book, and I think I'm gonna just let him stay there. You know, I think even if I go on to similar things, I sort of like where he ended up, and you know, we'll see if anybody wants to pay me enough money. I'll bring him back. I'll bring him back if he was dead. If he was dead, I'll bring him back. You know, that wouldn't stop me. So he's dead. I'll write that out.
You like the prequel.
Keep them on ice for a little while.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much. Oh,
One more.
question, absolutely.
I just have a question. You said you have another book you've already completed.
Mhm.
Are we gonna have to wait a year to get that one?
I'm hoping that will, well, you may have to wait a year, but I'm hoping you don't have to wait more than a year.
Because we've been looking for 2 months for your book.
Oh, that's sweet. Thank you. Thanks a lot. This is really a nerve. I got to be honest with you. I'm just sort of. I'm professional at this. You know, I mean, I've put enough books out that you know. You sit there on publication day, and I don't know what you do, but a lot of times on publication day, because your first thing is that night, or you know, I'm sitting there playing solitaire, or you know, pretending, you know,
I drink a lot of coffee.
yeah. So this book has the whole family is happy to get this book out into public hands at this point. I've been hard to live with, and you know, I want people to read this book. And of course, it seems also that there's been a lot of arts out there. So I don't know, you know, I'm seeing on Facebook all of it's your book now, but there's all these people seem to have read it too. I don't even know how it got in their hands, you know. But
Art means advanced reading company.
just a couple. Well, yeah, I mean, we all need a little context. Yeah, I didn't, but it did actually.
Well,
There you go.
Before we wrap it up, regarding the science in the book, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the post-war period, immediately post-war, when there was that great kind of race, you know, the space race, and the Russians and the Americans were all trying to get these German scientists out of Germany. And that all this, they were so far ahead of us in many ways. Is that tempting at all for a historical novel? Or do you feel like science?
You have an idea you want to push? Is
Well, matter of fact.
it actually is a good story, but it sounds more like Joseph Kenan or someone than me. But it actually is a good period to write about. You know, I'll have to say I was really terrible at science. That was very hard for me to do what I did in this book.
Well, there's so many of those guys, you know, that were, kind of given a free pass by the CIA.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's places to take that.
Right.
Obviously, from a mystery suspense point of view.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I think it actually is a good. We'll noodle some out. We'll see. So.
Well, hey, I'd like to thank you very much,
Oh,
and
pleasure.
congratulations.
Thank you, everyone.
And we'll break up and have you sign some books, and if you guys wouldn't mind just folding up your chair and putting it against the closest wall. Thank you very much.
All right. It's like JetBlue. Thank you. Where are you going?